Hello?
Hello, can you hear me now? You can hear me now? Yay. My microphone keeps shutting off on the keyboard, and I'm not exactly sure why. Okay. Sorry about all this trouble. So I've been going over course mechanics stuff. I want to keep going over course mechanics stuff to make sure that everyone knows what's going on. I spent about 5 minutes that you didn't hear me reviewing the letter that I sent around about grades. I'm not going to do that again because I sent around the letter. So I'll just take that as read. The big important point that that I made is if you're doing a video essay, please upload your video to YouTube. I couldn't figure out how to embed embed a video on Moodle directly, so I'm asking that you just upload it to YouTube. If you make the link on your post a hyperlink to a YouTube video, then Moodle will automatically embed it into your post. So if you're doing a video essay, just make sure you're embedding your video. I'll go around and correct that if I see mistakes, but you can help me a lot if you do that. Does anyone have any questions about the mechanics of the course, the assignment schedule? Remember, you have post 2 due this Friday. You also have the replies from week 1 due this Friday. Replies for week 2 will be due Friday after this one. So this little roving schedule. Does anyone have any questions about the mechanics of the course? Since I've tortured you for long enough, I'll go ahead and give you the word of the day for the sign-in sheet. The word of the day is O-ring. We're going to be talking about the Challenger explosion just a little bit. So the word of the day is O-ring. O-ring. You go ahead and put that in to the sign-in sheet and start signing in right now. All right. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump into lecture. Let me go ahead and get back in the lesson. All right. So the assignment this week is on the scope of ethical consideration. The discussion this week is on the scope of ethical consideration. This is still our introductory. We're still in the introductory phase of the course. Last week we were just thinking generally about how do values intersect with engineering. We had a lot of resources for thinking about different ways that values are reflected in our artifacts. And this week, the goal is to think about the scope of ethical consideration, namely, who gets considered by our values, right? Who is included in the decision-making process, right? Whose interests are considered, or what interests are considered, whose values, what kinds of considerations get taken into account as we make our ethical decisions. So there's lots of ways of asking this question. The first way that I'm going to ask the question is based on the NSPE. So a few of you have already looked at the NSPE Code of Ethics, and the first explicit concern in the Code for Ethics is the welfare of the general public, right? That the primary obligation of engineers is to regard the safety and well-being, the welfare of the general public as a primary concern. This is one of the fundamental canons. So one way of asking this question of the scope of ethical consideration is who counts as the public? Right? Who is included in that group and who isn't included in that group? Right? Is the public everyone? Is the public the citizens of our country? Right? Do immigrants or citizens of different countries count as part of the public? For instance, if we're engineering a product to be released in the United States, but it involves manufacturing in China, to what extent should we be considering the well-being of the Chinese workers who manufacture these products as part of the public addressed by these engineering concerns? Right, so who counts as part of the public? In your textbook, the public is often used to be contrasted with, in particular, your clients. So as an engineer, you're going to have clients who are asking you, who are contracting you out for doing specific kinds of jobs. And the clients have certain interests that you have obligations to meet as their engineer. If they're hiring you, you might be under contract to meet certain obligations to them. But the client is just one of the many people whose interests are at stake. And the book discusses the public in contrast to your clients. Right? So your clients have some interests, but those interests might conflict with the public, or with the public safety and well-being, for instance. If you're working for a weapons manufacturer, maybe your client has, right, the weapons manufacturer has interests in building certain kinds of weapons that would be a risk to the general public. And so then there's a question of, do you want to satisfy your client or do you want to satisfy the public? The Code of Ethics for Engineering says the public should always come first, more so than your client. But there's other groups also that might not be represented here, right? So sometimes the public, gets contrasted with citizens, voters, right? The voters have a disproportionate political voice, right? Because they're the ones who actually participate in the democratic process. But not everyone's a voter, right? There's lots of citizens, there's lots of people in the country who don't vote or maybe can't vote, right? And to what extent do those people get considered in our decision-making process? To what extent do those people not get considered? So this is the general topic of discussion. I have a couple of examples that I want to go over, but let me go ahead and stop here and see if there's any comments or questions, thoughts about the scope of the public. Thoughts?
They seem, to me at least, as an abstract concept. They're people I don't know. And unfortunately, I can't seem to care for. And I don't mean this as like I don't care for them in so much as I don't know them enough. If they were to die, it wouldn't be a huge impact on my life. And
if the public were to die?
If an individual of the public. Obviously, if the public were to die, well, we'd all be dead. I guess not obviously, because that would... Okay. But the point is it's an amorphous concept meant to like represent the antithesis of good for society. If society is the public, then things bad for the public are bad for society. It's a catch-all term for the people, the intelligences that are our society.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, it's a very general term, and it's supposed to be general. It's not supposed to be particular. So I have specific kinds of relationships with my family and with my friends, with my colleagues at work. Right, I have particular relationships with those people, but I don't have a particular relationship with the public. The public is just the general, all-encompassing group of people that I don't have any particular relationship to, but form the sort of backdrop of my society. So famously in political science, philosophers sometimes talk about a veil of ignorance. So they ask, what would justice be? How do we know that a system is fair? How do we know that the system is just? And one way that they do this is they talk about the veil of ignorance. So imagine that you don't know who you are in society, right? And you want to design a society such that anyone that right, you could be anyone in society, any one of those people that you end up as.
Yeah.
So you, go
Sorry.
ahead. Go
Sorry
ahead.
to interrupt, but there's a couple of science fictions about that, and there's some other sort of fantasy literature where essentially the plot is remove memories, get them to design a peace treaty, and then go with it.
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to be screwed, and if you're the other guy, you don't want to screw yourself through him. So,
right. So you want to design a system such that no matter who you end up as in that system, you're not doing so bad, right?
Yeah.
There's some people are going to end up winners and some people are going to end up losers, but you want to design the system so that the losers don't end up so bad because you might end up a loser, right? And in this case, you're not considering any specific properties of the people, but you're just considering them very generally. And that's kind of what's going on here with the public. You're right. We're thinking about people in the most general sense. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that thinking about people in this general sense requires not thinking about them in other ways, right? So again, in the book, they contrast the public with the client. The client is someone that you have a very specific kind of relationship with financial interests and other kinds of interests related to your career and so on, right? So the client is not the public, and the Code of Ethics here says that you ought to be concerned first and foremost with the welfare of the public and not with your client. But also other kinds of groups, right? Voters and citizens, right? The people of this country versus the public generally, right? To what extent is the public here the public within my community versus the public globally, people in other countries and so on, right? It's often the case that we just don't think about the impact of our engineering that our engineering has on other countries. My favorite example of this is the Foxconn suicides. Does anyone know about this Foxconn suicides? I think you guys can see me loading this up. Yeah. So Foxconn is a manufacturing company in China. Let me just actually look up Foxconn. Yeah, so Foxconn is in China. It's a manufacturer, the world's largest electronics manufacturer, and just about every electronics product you own is assembled by Foxconn employees, right? So any Apple product, any Dell product, any Microsoft, HP, Nintendo, Sony, any of these products that you have in your pocket was manufactured by Foxconn. They have these huge manufacturing plants that often contain live-in housing dorms for the workers to stay. During the summer months, they are ramping up production to get ready for our holiday shopping spree in the States, and all that stuff is produced by these plants. Sometimes people stay in these manufacturing facilities, never leaving the facility for months at a time. Right? They live in one corner. There's a little grocery store at the other corner that they get credits to buy stuff in, and then they go onto the manufacturing floor and work for 8 or 10 hours a day. And the conditions here are very bad. In fact, so bad that there was a rash of suicides. So something like 15 people committed suicide in 1 year, 18 people, 14 deaths. And it was because of the poor working conditions, right? People paid very little money, low monthly wage, and then working in these. I mean, it's not sweatshop conditions. This is high-end electronics, so there has to be sort of clean rooms. Can't be a sweatshop. But even still, the pressure put on them and the working conditions are bad. That a bunch of people committed suicide, and they mostly committed suicide by jumping from the building. And so Foxconn responded to these suicides with netting. So around the Foxconn buildings nowadays, they have these nets to catch people from jumping off the buildings because it happens so often that this is the best way of preventing it from happening. these are the kinds of conditions that exist in other countries, but it's entirely the product of US consumption habits, right? It's because we want all these electronics and we want them cheap enough so that we can afford on our income. So through our consumer demand, we're incurring working conditions that are literally driving people to suicide in other countries, right? So to what extent should the well-being of electronics manufacturers in China be a consideration for our own decisions here in the United States? Right? How much should our choice of electronics purchases, right? Should we stop buying Apple because of what happens to their employees or the contracted employees, for instance, right? These are, I'm not asking you to answer these questions directly, but these are questions that come up under the general label of the scope of ethical consideration, right? Who gets considered? To what extent are their interests decisive in our decision making? Thoughts, comments? Yeah, you can ask questions in the chat. You can also just jump on the mic and interrupt me. I'm fine with that too.
I couldn't help but notice, but that sounded a lot like wage slaves.
Foxconn?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, when you said they were paid in credits, they weren't paid in currency, they were paid in artificial tokens of worth.
Sometimes that's the case. It depends on where, I mean, that's the kind of thing that happens in wage slave systems, that's right. I'm not sure if that's been found in Foxconn. I do know that they talk about it in terms of labor camps where they stay inside these camps for long hours. They're separated. These manufacturing plants are usually out in the country, away from the city, and so people sort of go out there and live in that facility for a few months, and then come back to the city when the summer's over and the working spree is gone.
I also feel like we're forgetting a significant portion of the issue, which is we can design things that can save lives, but there's always the economic aspects of it. It needs to be cheap. A lot of the times it needs to be mass manufacturable. So like the issue with all of these telecom places or the electronics manufacturers, it seems to me that they had almost a monopoly. And with the large populations, from my understanding, in places like China, which allows you to undersell your workers because there's always somebody to take the job, can result in those conditions. So there's a engineering aspect to it. It was kind of expensive to make, and it was a brand name product, which is always probably like 10-20% increase, even if the performance isn't the same. So yeah, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that you can design cheap objects, but that doesn't mean those objects will be sold cheaply.
So you're definitely right that there's economic considerations, and basically what the economic considerations amount to is that we're willing to sacrifice 14 suicides, a bunch of suicides, a dozen suicides for $500 iPhones. Right, but
how much is a person worth? Apparently $500.
Well, it's worth the few. I mean, we could have better labor conditions if the iPhones cost a few $100s more, right? If we were willing to pay $300 more.
But then they won't be. Then they won't be worth as much. You won't sell them as much. It'll be less impetus to make more.
Mm-hmm.
It goes against a lot of Western consumerism.
Right. So in the chat, someone says, it seems to me that big industry are profiting significantly off the workers in Foxconn. But it's not just big industry. It's all of us consumers who are profiting off these cheap electronics. And, maybe you're getting your phone from someone other than Apple that's not being made at Foxconn facilities, but that other phone still has to compete with those, right? So Foxconn is still making an impact on the market so that all the other phones have to compete. So, I mean, this isn't just a decision being made by the big industry. This is a decision being made by all the consumers as they purchase these products and encourage these kinds of labor practices. It's often not the case that we think about any of this when we make our purchase. It's usually the case we're just thinking about having this nice gadget that we can play with. And so this is exactly this question of the scope of ethical consideration, right? What actually gets included in consideration, what doesn't. I think, to my mind, the best example of this, so these were supposed to be just instructive, getting us to think about this, but the best example of the scope of ethical consideration, it's a classic engineering case, but it's the Challenger case. So in your book, pages 106 to 113, go over the Challenger disaster in quite a bit of detail. And so during the Challenger, there was this independent contractor, Morton Feuchel, that was making the rockets, and they were under pressure to get these rockets in on time. Just the morning of this Challenger disaster, there had been the presidential State of the Union address. Ronald Reagan gave the presidential address. Oh no, I'm sorry. He was going to give the address that night, and there was a lot of pressure to have a successful launch in the morning, so that he could have something to gloat about that evening when he went in the State of the Union address. So there was this political pressure on NASA. Morton Feuchel was also up for a contract for a contract renewal, and so there was also a lot of pressure on them to get their rockets to work well. The Challenger launch had already been delayed for like a month, and people were really eager to get it up in the sky. But there was the concern, especially there was concern about the O-rings. This is why O-rings is the word of the day. That these O-rings weren't reliable, especially in very cold weather. The day of the launch was supposed to be in weather much colder than they'd ever done even a test launch before. And the engineers responsible for these rockets at Morton Feuchel were convinced that it wasn't safe to launch on this date. And they had put in recommendations to postpone the launch yet again, despite the president's request, right? Despite all this pressure to keep the launch going. So the engineers had all put in their request to not do the launch, specifically concerned about these O-rings, that the O-rings wouldn't be tested, that it was supposed to be very, very cold. So they didn't want to do the launch. And there were lots of meetings about whether or not to do the launch. In particular, there was this management meeting the night before the launch, where the vice president, Jerry Mason, told the the senior vice president, Jerry Mason, told the vice president of engineering, Bob Lund. They're having this meeting, and Bob Lund is hearing from all his engineers tell him that the O-rings aren't safe. And so Bob Lund is telling them that, look, the engineers are saying this is not a safe launch. And Jerry Mason turns to Bob Lund in the middle of this meeting and says, you need to take off your engineering hat and you need to put on your management hat, right? You need to stop thinking like an engineer. You need to start thinking like a manager, right? The engineers have lots of worries. It's their job to have the worries, but there's other considerations at stake here, right? There's these management considerations, considerations about renewing the contract, considerations about the presidential address, right? The state of the nation, right? And these considerations, from the management's perspective, take precedent. Right? Take off your engineering hat and put on your manager's hat. So one of the things I like most about this story is that it shows that these ethical decisions aren't just between two different people who might have opposing views, who might have opposing values. It's often the case, and in fact, most of the really hard ethical decisions that you'll yourself encounter will be not you versus someone else who has an opposing view, but you versus yourself, because you can see that there are, in fact, two opposing views. And this is a great example of this, right? Bob Lund is both the vice president for engineers, and so he's in constant contact with the engineers. He's thinking like an engineer because those are his employees. But on the other hand, he's also a manager, right? He's also the vice president, and there's this whole top-down pressure from management to behave differently than how the engineers are behaving. And so in this case, Bob Lund is pulled in two directions by himself, right? It's his commitment to the engineers, the people below him on the hierarchy, or it's his commitment to the management, people above him on the hierarchy, right? And in this case, he's simultaneously, right, an engineer and a manager, right? He wears both hats. And the question here isn't what is the right thing to do in the general sense. The question here is which hat does he want to wear, right? Does he want to be thinking like an engineer, or does he want to be thinking like a manager? And it's open to him, and he chose, in this instant, right, from this pressure to think like a manager, and he ended up ignoring the engineer's request to postpone the launch, going through with the launch anyway, and the next morning the Challenger broke up about a minute and a half into launch, exploded over the ocean, and all the astronauts inside died. Let me look at some of these questions. So someone asked, so the question becomes, choose the hat where less people die. I mean, it's not always clear which hat will be the one where less people die. It's not always clear what the right decision will be. Most of the time, it's not going to be a clean decision between what's obviously right and what's obviously wrong. Most of the time, it's going to be a decision between one perspective and another, where you can see clearly virtues and vices with both perspectives, right? You can see good reasons for making one decision and bad reasons for making that same decision, and then you can see good reasons for making a different decision and bad reasons for making that decision also. And it's not just a matter of, just make what's obviously the best choice, because it's sometimes not clear what the best choice is. It's sometimes very hard to decide what the best choice is, and you're getting pressure from both ends, right? From the people below you, the people above you, to make a decision about how you're going to act next, to make a decision about what your values actually are, right? Are your commitments stronger to solid engineering or good management? Right? It seems like we're 50-50. What should be the takeaway on this? The takeaway on this is that decisions are hard, and they're going to push on different aspects of your identity, different aspects of your value systems. And this is why an ethics class like this is so important, because our values, even for our own selves, are often not clear. They're often amorphous and ambiguous, and it's often not clear how we'll make a decision when it comes time to make it. In retrospect, knowing that the Challenger is going to break up, it looks ridiculous for Bob Lund to choose his management hat over his engineering hat. And secretly, this is one of the reasons why this is such a popular case in an engineering ethics class, is because it makes the engineers look really good, and it makes management look really incompetent. Right? Management's making a bunch of bad decisions, and engineers here, right? If you just followed the engineers, you would have made the right decision. That's the kind of story that engineers like, because it makes them look not only important, but not only correct, but important to the decision-making process. In fact, in the aftermath of the Challenger case, a lot of the commentary was that you should just listen to the engineers because they're the ones who actually know what the safety limits are. How far you can push these machines and what's where you can't push it. If you're just worried about the politics, right? If you're just worried about Ronald Reagan giving a good speech, then you're going to be making unsafe choices. And so the conclusion from the Challenger case seems to be to trust the engineers, but we'll see later on that the engineers aren't always going to be making the right decisions. It's not just a matter of always wearing your engineering hat. Maybe sometimes management's going to be making the right decisions and the engineers don't see the full picture. The point is that no one is ever going to see the full picture, and everyone's always coming at these issues from perspectives, sometimes multiple perspectives, and sometimes people are internally torn about which perspective they prefer, which side to adopt. Yeah, that's why you have to think before you decide. And not only do you have to think before you decide, but you have to think about how your values work, right? What really is important to you? You're going to come into cases where there really is a decision between safety and your career, right? If I cut this corner, I might have an advantage in my career. I might, get this promotion or whatever. But at the same time, I've put a lot of people at risk. Is that risk worth the chance of promotion? I'm not saying that there are any straightforward answers to these questions. These are the difficult questions and making the right decision in these cases is going to depend a lot on the context, on exactly what the risks are and what the benefits are. And so the goal for you is to think about your own values, about how you want to be making these decisions should they come up, right? Which hats are you most comfortable wearing, and which hats are you okay putting down and saying that that's not how I'm going to make this decision? Yeah, there's too many variables. Too many variables, and you can't predict the future. So there's no right answer to these questions because it's not set in stone what the best decision-making process is. So this is why I'm putting this all under the labeling of the scope of ethical consideration. Sometimes it's not entirely clear to people why or how this lesson is different from lesson 1. In lesson 1, I was just trying to think about the general relationship between values and engineering. And this, I really want you to think about the scope, who gets included in that. uh, in that discussion. So I have these engineering cases about the roles of professionals and what special obligations professionals have in these contexts. I think the example of taking off your engineering hat and putting on your management hat is a great example of how how professionals can get pulled in different ways because of their professional role. So this stuff is interesting. The other thing I have here is required reading, and this will also appear in the quiz. Is this? It's sort of a well, it's a commencement speech, so it's sort of optimistic, big picture. This is life. This is David Foster Wallace. He's a novelist, a writer. He gives this "This is Water" speech. The really important thing if we had more time, I would probably go through this speech in the video. But the really important thing is that he's talking about our choices over what to think about, how to think, and he talks about what he calls our default position or default perspective, which is to be self-interested, which is to think that my interests and my values and my world is all that really matters and is all that I need to take into account when making my decisions. So he talks in the speech about people stuck in line at in a grocery store, which is I experienced this just the other day while everyone was in line at the grocery store waiting for the blizzard, stocking up on essentials, bread and stuff. A lot of people were buying ice cream, but the lines at the grocery store were very, very long. Lots of people were stocking up in preparation for the blizzard. And you might, in that situation, get annoyed. Look at all these people in my way, right? I have to do this thing, and all these people are just in my way, slowing me down, right? Making this process a lot more tedious and awful than it needs to be. And we often get into this kind of mode of thinking where why isn't things easier for me? Why aren't things going my way? We often get into this cycle of thinking where my interests trump everything else, where my interests are the really important interests, and none of the other interests matter. But I mean, in this case, in the blizzard, everyone there is there for the same reason, is because we're stocking up before a major storm, and everyone there has a legitimate reason to be there. They're not just in my way. I mean, in some sense, I'm in their way also, right? So understanding that I'm just one part of this system, and that my perspective and my interests only are a little bit of this much more complex system that's much bigger than me, with people who have interests and needs that have nothing to do with me, getting outside of my head, getting outside of my own perspective, and learning to appreciate the perspective of others, because we all have to cooperate with each other. It requires going beyond the default. It requires not just settling into this easy pattern of self-concern, but learning to be concerned genuinely about others, learning to think beyond my own world and see the world from other people's eyes. Right? This requires deliberate practice. It requires paying attention and adopting perspectives. And other perspectives, it's not an easy thing to adopt. It's always easiest to go with the default. It's always easiest to concern yourself on these purely local, purely internal concerns. But the world's much bigger than any of us. So I'm putting that up there for you to think about, and maybe fit this discussion of professional ethics into a much larger discussion of ethics generally. I just want to say a few more things about some of these optional readings, just to fit them in with this general discussion. So we're talking about the scope of ethical consideration, right? Who gets considered. So far, all of our discussion has been about people, right? The public, different groups of people compared to the public. Are people the only things we have to care about? Well, that's not always obvious. So I have some alternative views here that try to expand the scope even wider. Most famously on this is Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a consequentialist. We'll learn about consequentialism next week. But Peter Singer here argues about poverty, sort of in relation to the Foxconn discussion we were having earlier, about what do I spend my money on? Am I spending my money only on things that make me happy? A nice outfit or whatever, a nice pair of shoes. That $100 pair of shoes might make me happy a little bit, but that same $100 might feed a family of 4 for a week. And is my shoes worth the meal for that family of 4? Right? Peter Singer thinks that usually our decision-making process is just too self-absorbed, and that we ought to, in fact, be a lot more generous with our money. We ought to be donating to charity, giving away a lot more of our stuff, not just to be charitable, but because we have a moral obligation to do so. And Peter Singer thinks that it would be wrong not to do so. He says we ought to give the money away, and it's wrong not to do so. Not that we ought to give all of our money away, but we ought to just keep enough money to live, and the rest of it we ought to be giving to other people who could use it more, or who could do more with it. Which this is, again, considering about the scope of ethical consideration. Peter Singer's also consequentialism argues in a similar vein for things like vegetarianism and animal rights. In general, the consequentialists, like Peter Singer, tend to think that moral values get associated with sentience, with the capacity to feel pain and pleasure. Right, and so so this is why he's comparing the little bit of pleasure that I have with my $100 shoes versus the pain and suffering that a family of four has not eating for a week. Right, so how does that pain contrast with my pleasure? Right, how do we offset it so that it all balances out the right way? And Peter Singer thinks that not only do human beings suffer and feel pain, but so do the animals. In fact, lots of animals feel suffer and pain, and we don't consider it very much at all when we, eat our steak, right, or the ham that we have over Christmas. And we don't tend to think about not only the suffering of the pig, but also the impact of the factory farming that pig was raised in, right? The antibiotics and all the environmental waste that's created through that factory farming process. Right, so the well-being of the animals, the animal ethics, usually doesn't get included in the scope of ethical consideration. In the professional code of ethics, I don't remember if there's anything about animals in particular, but it's certainly not among the fundamental canons. Right? The fundamental canons is about the welfare of the public, not about the animals. Should the animals be considered? So I have another reading here from David Foster Wallace called Consider the Lobster, where he thinks not just about animals generally, but he thinks about lobsters in particular. He goes to the Maine Lobster Fest, where they grill up like thousands of lobsters, and he likens it to a Roman circus or a medieval torture fest. David Foster Wallace is not a vegetarian. In fact, he eats lobsters during the article, but he's not immediately clear that he's not immediately sure that he's doing the ethically right thing when he does so. Right? So he says my own immediate reaction to the comparison to the medieval torture fest. He says my own immediate reaction is that such a comparison is hysterical, extreme. Yet the reason it seems extreme to me appears to be because I believe that animals are less morally important than human beings. But when it comes to defending such a belief, even to myself, I have to acknowledge that A, I have an obvious selfish interest in the belief, since I like to eat certain kinds of animals and I want to keep doing it. And B, I have not succeeded in working out any sort of personal ethical system where the belief is truly defensible instead of just selfishly convenient. And I like this distinction between something that's truly defensible versus something that's just selfishly convenient. Perhaps all of these ethical choices to eat animals and so on is merely from convenience and not from an ethical correctness. Maybe we're wrong to eat animals or to give them so little consideration in our decision-making process, but we do it anyway because we're merely selfish, right? We're merely selfishly concerned. The final article I have here is from Aldo Leopold, an environmentalist, a conservationist from the mid-20th century. He writes the Land Ethic, I believe it's 1950, something around there, where he talks about not just obligations to the animals and the sentient creatures, the creatures that can feel pain and pleasure, but to the environment itself. The environment doesn't feel pain and pleasure, at least not like the animals do. But the environment can suffer, it can degrade, and Leopold here argues that we have an obligation to maintain the well-being not just of the people and the animals, but also of the environment itself, of the soil. He calls it the land ethic. He says we might have obligations to soils, waters, to the land itself, and not just the animals that live on the land, but to the land itself. Right, so this is maybe the widest scope of ethical consideration. And in fact, Leopold begins his article talking about ethics as this process of increasingly widening the scope of ethical consideration. Right, so he says, a long time ago we had ethical consideration, just for the landowning white males, who were the citizens of the government, and they were the ones who had actual political influence. But the women and the children, the minorities, didn't have any political influence. And Leopold says, and what's happened over time is that ethics slowly expands the scope of ethical consideration, including more and more interests into our consideration, or into our decision-making process, extending consideration to women, to animals, to children. And Leopold thinks that if the history of ethical progress is this expanding scope of ethical consideration, then the natural place for it to extend to next is the environment, just to the land itself. Maybe it extends even further than that. Maybe it extends also to the robots that we build, that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that later on in the semester. I'm basically done going over the class. Does anyone have any last comments? It looks like there's been quite a bit of discussion. Looks like it's been good discussion. If anyone has any comments or thoughts before I sign off. Lobsters are delicious, that's right. They're also basically insects. Okay. Yeah, so the word of the day, one more time, was O-rings. If you go online to the online forum, you can get attendance for today with the word of the day is O-rings. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and comments about the scope of ethical consideration. Remember to leave your posts by this Friday. You can earn attendance credit on this video anytime before midnight tonight. All right.
Thank you for your time, Professor.
Yep. See you all next week.
Bye.